It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Avri Fischer. We're here in your beautiful home in the Kibbutz Kfar Masarek in northern Israel. And Avri, really, thank you so much for allowing me to hear your story and your history of your family and you.
Yeah, my history begins a little bit more than 86 years ago when I was born in Vienna. But my parents and their families, their forefathers and foremothers, lived in Slovakia, which at that time was part of Austro-Hungary, Hungarian Empire. And actually, maybe a week after I was born, they returned together with me from Vienna to Bratislava. And I think that my Brit Milah was in Bratislava already. And ever since I lived in Bratislava until my Aliyah, except of a few months close to the end of World War II, when I was in hiding out of the town, which I will mention later. As a child, I grew up in a very beautiful area in the middle of the town, but I think I was 2 or 3 years old. I do remember some pictures isolated from each other about the apartment at which we lived in Bratislava. I have no specific memories of that place, but I know that we had to leave that place because of the rules of the new Slovak fascist pro-Nazi regime. Jews were not allowed to live in that beautiful section of the town, which, by the way, today hosts the American Embassy. The American Embassy is exactly at the place at which we lived. It only shows that it was a nice place at that time, and it's nice today as well. We had to move to another place. At that time, it meant nothing to me. I don't even remember that my parents told me we are moving from one place to another. We just moved, and I have more memories of the second place at which we lived, which was not very far from it, but a little bit less noble, I might say so. And I remember that at the second place, from my window on the second floor, I saw the Hlinka Guard, which is the Slovak version of the SS, marching on the street below. And I still remember seeing them, even today, in their black uniforms and singing their songs, which at that time did not have anti-Semite connotations, but it was rather patriotic, chauvinistic, I might say. But I remember these pictures, having seen them through the window. We lived in that second place for about 2 years, and when I was about 6 years old or so, in 1941, we were forced to leave that place too. And we went, luckily enough, to a place which for me was the most beautiful one that a child could have imagined, with or without any connotation with the war. It was a villa which belonged to the matriarchal part of my family. It was owned by my grandparents from my mother's part, and their children, my mother, her brother, and her sister, inherited that villa. And we moved to that villa and lived in it from 91, except of a certain section during the war, during the Holocaust, until we made Aliyah in 1949. And it was a beautiful villa, not a very fancy one, but a beautiful one for me. And a huge garden with fruits and many other things which I remember as a very, how would I say, very pleasant to me. At the age of 6, more or less, I started understanding what's happening around us. Only then I started grasping why we had to leave the first and the second place and move to the third one. At that time, I began understanding that there is a persecution of Jews because I remember my mother packing some of her beautiful goods, you know, some golden articles, furs she had, and so on. I said, "Mom, what are you doing with it?" And she said, "We were ordered to give it to the government, but I have a good friend, a Gentile woman, who said, give it to me, and when the war is over, I will return it to you." And I remember my mother was packing that, and my mother and father gave some items to what they had to give, but it was a rather formal presentation or whatever, because the very good and valuable things went to someone else. And they were hidden there, and they were returned to my parents after the war.
She did return it?
It was, yeah. I went to school from 1941, first grade and second grade. Close to the end of second grade, in 1942, maybe in fact, the Jewish school was closed. Now, I did not go to an Orthodox Jewish school, but to what was called in Slovakia neolog. I don't know whether you are familiar with it. It is somewhere between Reform and conservative of today.
It was very big in Budapest.
Yeah, in any case, I went to that school with all the Jewish holidays and beautiful things, but at some time, my parents, and probably I too, were told that the school has to be closed. Whether the school was closed because at that time deportations began and there were no more Jewish children to go to the school, except those who were protected, like myself, and I will tell you in a moment why I was protected. Or it was just because they just wanted to cut off stage by stage Jewish life. And of course, school is Jewish life at present and looking towards the future, which they didn't want the Jews to have that view of the future. And I was not allowed to attend a non-Jewish, a general school as a Jew. And therefore I went to a private home at which I lived. I studied one school year, 42, 43, 44, 1 year, together with 4 other boys in a private school to which I walked every day about 20-25 minutes from my villa home to that place and back. The closing of the school was one of the stages at which I only later understood that it was one step of many steps taken against Jews. I remember another one which gave me the feeling of something that is bad to Jews as a child. Our family in that villa absorbed a Jewish family of refugees from Poland. I remember their name, Frankel was their name. A couple, man and woman. And they lived with us. Probably the Jewish community asked other Jews whether they are ready to accept refugees. We did, my parents did. And they lived with us. All of a sudden they disappeared. And I saw them no longer. Thanks to some intervention, I don't know by whom, they returned from a place called Žilina in northern Slovakia, which was a place of passage of temporary concentration of Jews, because before they were expelled to Poland and to Auschwitz. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I don't know how long, they returned from Žilina to Bratislava to our place. And my parents were very happy to see them again with us, because at that time my parents already knew, probably from my aunt, what was going on in Poland. I don't know how long it took until they were taken again, and I remember that the Slovak guard, the Hlinka guard, which I mentioned before, came with a truck to the front, to the street which was below our villa and the garden, and I was playing with my non-Jewish friend in the street when the truck stopped, and I saw some 10 or 12 men and women standing on the truck. Two of the Hlinka guard came into the garden. They picked up the Frankels from our home. They guided them down and made them climb up the truck, and the truck disappeared. And I already knew at that time that they disappeared probably forever. How did I know? My parents never hid before me the reality. And they were always telling me certain things, one of which I will tell you in a moment. But one specific moment I remember from my age of 8 or so, 1943. My mother received a postcard from Poland, from the Frankels, in which they wrote, "We are in a new settlement in Poland, and we hope to have good work," and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, while reading that, I was alone with my mother in my parents' bedroom. And my mother burst into a loud voice saying, "It is not true. They kill Jews in gas chambers." At the age of 8, I heard that. Now I knew that gas, the poison of gas, is dangerous because we have gas in the kitchen, in the kitchen, whatever. When I heard about gas killing people by purpose in camps, it was such a shock to me that I remember until today the very spot at which I stood and where my mother stood reading that thing. So it was maybe one of the culminations of how I got to know what was happening and what are the dangers at store for us. A comment in between. In 1942, the first deportations from Slovakia took place. At that time, I didn't understand, didn't know about it. I only knew that young women were sent to Poland, girls and young women. My parents told me, and I may have already started reading newspapers. I don't know in what paper it was written, whether it was in a Slovak fascist governmental paper, or was it some publication of the Jewish community? I cannot tell you. Some of the Jews of Bratislava, I think a few thousand at that time, but of course I'm telling you things I learned much later, were expelled from Bratislava to some places, in the country, in Slovakia. I don't know how many of them were deported to Poland, but I knew that some of my parents' friends were no longer in Bratislava. How come my father was protected? My father was a physician, a doctor, a pediatrician. And as the Slovaks did not have enough of their own non-Jewish Gentile doctors, they used the service of the Jewish doctors for the population at large. And along with some papers called in Slovak exemption that was given to people who were of economic importance to Slovakia, and therefore they were saved from deportation, they and their families. There were some doctors, not all of them, who were also saved, and my father was among them. Thanks to that, my father, my mother, and I and I was their only child, we were also protected. So we passed through the period of 1942, during which about 2/3 of the Slovak Jewish population was expelled to Poland. We survived it, and then came a little bit calmer situation, 43 until the summer of 44. During that period, in 94, the Jewish star was introduced in Slovakia, and every person, as of age 6 and up, had to have the Jewish star, I think, here in the chest and maybe in the back too, I don't know. My parents told me the following: we, as many other Jews, are ordered to carry that yellow star. We have no way to escape it, because people in the city know your dad, my mom said, and father said, they know me, him. Because he served not only the Jewish population, he served others as well. And it was known on the street. So when we go on the street to any place, let's say to some relatives who are still in town, thanks to their reasons, or to any other place, we will never go together, you and mom and dad. Mom and dad, we, they told me, when we walk in the street, we go with our stars. You will go without a star, 10 or so steps behind us. Look at us all the time, look at our backs. And you know that they grab people in the middle of the street. It may happen to us, despite the fact that my father, physician, is protected, quasi. And if that happens, they told me, you don't panic. You don't start to cry. You just turn around and go to your aunt, not Gizzy Fleischmann. My mother's brother, Gustav Perl, who was an optician, married a Gentile woman, a Catholic Jew woman, who came from Hungary. And they had a very happy marriage, a childless marriage, and my relationship with them was extraordinarily beautiful. So my parents told me, in case we are being caught on the street, you just go to your aunt called Itza. Itza was her nickname, and she knows what to do with you. So I was trained like you train a dog or anyone. And at that time, slowly, as things accumulated around me, I felt how my fear and horror is creeping into me gradually, one after another. And I told you some of the things. There might have been more, which I don't remember at this moment, but slowly they were from all angles coming upon me, and I was ready for the worst, including that something may happen to me too. In 1944, at the end of August, there was an outbreak of the Slovak uprising against their own regime, an anti-Nazi uprising, of which the German intelligence knew beforehand, and they immediately occupied Slovakia, the German troops. And of course it was not only the German Wehrmacht, the army, it was the SS and Gestapo as well. I do not know exactly when a German secret agent came to my house, to our house, but I remember someone talking in German, which was a language I knew well, with my mother. My father was probably at work. She was at home and I was at home. I remember him wearing a long coat, whatever. And they were talking, I don't know what about, but it was in German, it was not a Slovak. Only later, in my speculations, I never talked about it with my mother, and I'm sorry. There are 5,000 questions I would have asked my parents about ABC and endlessly, but it is one of the questions I didn't ask, and I don't know what exactly wanted this particular person to talk to my mother about. But he visited. Was it before the occupation of the German occupation, when they already, were around the Germans? There was a very huge intervention of the Germans in Slovakia at that time. You may have called the name of Vyslyceni. Mm-hmm. Dieter Vyslyceni was the person with whom the working group of Gizi Fleischmann, Rabbi Weissman, and their co-workers negotiated about, bribing him and stopping the deportations. So there was Vyslyceni, but maybe there were 1,000 others, and one of them may have visited my place and talked to my mother. At the moment the Germans occupied, my parents knew that we have to go into hiding. And my parents told me the following, both. Right? We had a very emotional talk. They told me, the moment came at which we are in an immediate danger, and you know what danger it is. We have to hide, and we found a very unusual place. Next door to us, there is a noble family of what is called in German Graf, which is more or less like a duke or whatever in English, I don't know exactly, a baron, of German origin, with the Hungarian name Gyulay, and they offered us a little shack, a wooden place where they used to store wood or whatever, crates and so on and so forth. They told me, my parents told me, that we can hide in that place, and we, our parents, came to an agreement with them that if we are caught, in order not to endanger those Gyulay family, we will all tell them that we invaded that place without them knowing about it, their neighbors. We just crossed the border. And they would tell, we don't know about anyone because we never went up. It was about 50 or so, 60 meters above their living quarters, and they, it was well prepared. So I started hearing that we were going to that place. And then my parents came with what shocked me terribly. It is a place at which you are not going to be with us, because it is not in conditions at which a child can survive. It has no electricity, no heating, no water, absolutely nothing. It is just a storage place, that's it. The supply to us will be given by our sister-in-law, the non-Jewish sister-in-law of my parents, my aunt, Itza, who would cross the border and give them food, water, and whatnot. I mean, whatever they needed. But you cannot be with us. And it was for me a very terrible shock. And I started crying, and maybe more than that, telling them that I want to be with them, and so on. Nothing helped me. And they told me, you have to leave this place, and you will not be with us. We don't know for how long. Your aunt will take you to people who are ready to host you. And there you will hide, and she will take correspondence between you and us, and that's what happened. today for me, the departure of my departure from my parents and my parting from them is still a very traumatic experience, one of the most traumatic experiences I had, because it was accompanied by terrible fear that I will never see my parents again. So I went to one place. At that place, a couple with two boys, they were very nice people, non-Jewish of course. They told me, at night you will sleep at our neighbor's place. You have to climb the ladder on our side, you go on the ladder on the other side down, you will sleep there, in the morning you will return to us. Why was that policy? I never learned. They were fearful probably that I will be caught there. Why the other ones were more courageous, I don't know. I have no idea. And okay, I accepted that fact. It was not a big problem for me. At that time I was 9.5 years of age, climb the ladder, go down. But at the other place, in one of the evenings, it's about 9, 10, maybe 8, everything was dark already, and it was September, October, fall. I heard voices come in German, ask the landlord, sir, good evening, are you alone at home? Oh, he said, no, my wife is in bed. Who else? Well, I have a little boy here. Are there any Jews here? I said, no Jews. Who is that little boy? He said, that little boy is a Catholic boy from eastern Slovakia. We were asked by the authorities to accept him in our home because he is an orphan. He lost his parents in some bombardment in the east, and we are ready to host him at our home. We want to see that child, they said. I heard that in German. They spoke to each other. Where is he? So he said, he is there. And he led them into the room at which I pretended sleeping, because I was already not only alert to hear what they said, but I was in a terrible fear and feeling of horror. And they came to my bed, and I made myself sleep, and one said to the other in German, lit the flashlight on his face, let's see him. He did so, and I felt the flashlight on my eyes, which were closed, and one said to the other, oh, it's a beautiful, nice, blonde-haired child. At that time I had blonde. He doesn't look Jewish, what do you say? No, he doesn't look Jewish, said the other. Okay, so let's leave, and they left. It took about 10 seconds, 15, maybe half a minute, I don't know. I was trembling, I was in terrible fear, and I don't remember whether at that time I ever fell asleep, because I was in a terrible fear. But they left. But as the news caught my parents and my aunt and the landlord and all of it, they said, no longer I can stay in that place. So my aunt came on the following day, and she took me to another place. The first one, which I described right now, was not far from our original home, but in a certain detour we got to it. My second or third, because day and night is two places. My third hiding place was in the middle of the old town of Bratislava. My aunt took me hand by hand through certain streets which I can today return to them and tell you exactly where I went, to the middle of the town in a small tiny street. We climbed to the third floor of it, and she told me on the way that the person who is going to hide you is a German Slovak, meaning a citizen of Slovakia, of German nationality, what is called Volksdeutsche. They were all around in many countries, and they were ready to get to you, to their place. And Not only that, she told me, as a German, he was mobilized to the German army. So you're going to hide in a place at which a German soldier is going to hide a Jewish child. I came to them. He seemed to be very old. He might have been 40 years old or so, gray hair, short, not a very tall person. His wife, whose name I'm not so sure, but I think it was Paula. His first name I don't remember. Their last name was Heger. And I lived with them until January 1945, from October, about 3 months or so. I was never allowed to leave that place. I lived on the 3rd floor. I came only once or twice to the cellar when there were some air raids and bombardment was in immediate danger. So they said to me, you come with us to the cellar, but don't speak to any of the neighbors who are gathering there. But there were two things which are, let's say, the negative part of it, except of my being far away from my parents with a constant concern about their well-being, but with an almost daily contact with my aunt who came to visit. She brought to me little notes from my parents. I wrote to them. The order was that I have to burn them immediately, what my parents wrote to me. Unfortunately, I would pay, I don't know how much, if I could find today one of those papers, but they are no longer with me. Well, there were two bad things. One was the son of the Hagers, who was at that time 14 or 15, and he was just a young sadist. He was hitting me day by day. Every time we were left alone, the father went to the army. He probably was I don't know exactly, a guardian in trains or whatever. And the mother went out shopping and so on. And at times I was left home with him, and he just, all his badness or whatever, madness and badness and whatever else, he was putting on me, and I suffered physically and mentally, being humiliated by a person stronger than me, who said that if I tell anything to his parents about what he is doing to me, he's going to take me to the street and tell the SS men who were their headquarters just across the street. There was the headquarters of SS. Tell them that I found this Jewish child and give them over to me. They could have discovered that I am circumcised, and take me away. In any case, I, during the probably last months, maybe, before that it was quite quiet, but the whole month of December 44, I suffered both physically and mentally from that boy. It was a terrible experience for me.
And his parents, were they nice to you? Were they decent?
They were against Nazis. The whole family was against. So the boy was hitting me not because I was a Jew, probably, but because I was a little child and he was a distraught person.
A bully?
A boy who had no friends whatsoever. And I cannot go into his psychological state, but it was a terrible experience for me. My, how would I say, savage or whatever, rescue came when Mr. Hager came to me in the beginning of January and told me that they and I go with them, we leave Bratislava and go to a farm out of the city. And that means that you will have no connection with your aunt, but we have to leave the town because every time the Russians are bombing the city and we live in an immediate danger and so on. So we left the town and I came to a little farm between two villages, about 30 or so kilometers north of Bratislava. In that farm, I felt all of a sudden fresh air, because I could leave the place at which we lived. They did not tell any of the farmers that I'm a Jewish child. And I was considered by them as a city boy, a Slovak city boy, and I spoke fluent Slovak. They never asked me about my background, so I didn't have to tell them that I am an orphan of Catholic parents from Eastern Slovakia, but I had my papers with me. I had my falsified papers, and my fake name was František, which is a Slovak name, and the last name was Falada. That was mine. I had my papers, František Falada, born there, etc., etc. I lived in that farm until the end of the war. 3-4 months, January until April. And I had no contact with my parents. I went to sleep, I woke up, I walked and played with the boys without stopping thinking about the fate of my parents. That was my main fear. I felt safe enough, much safer than in the city, because nobody knew me and so on. On Sundays, I used to walk with them to the Catholic church in the nearby village, which I knew the prayers. After all, I had to learn the Catholic prayers, and I knew them by heart. Today, I only remember the beginning of them.
Did you go into the church as well?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And I remember that at that time, I prayed, even before going to sleep, I prayed the Catholic prayers, knowing that I am still a Jew. And I said to myself, if there is one God in heaven, the same God will listen to me when I pray Baruch Atah Adonai in Hebrew, or when I say this and this in Slovak. You know, so that's my childhood perception of God and my relationship to Him, and so on. But in any case, I lived there. I started working at the age of 10. January, I was 10. And then liberation came. The first Russian soldier whom I saw is still in front of my eyes. He rode a horse. He looked at me for a moment, an instant, and rode into the fog. It was a very foggy morning in April, and disappeared. And the Russians came in, and I had some very interesting experience with Russians, which I'm going to skip now. And I was waiting to return to the town together with them and meet my parents again, only with the hope that they survived the war.
You didn't know any news about
I did nothing about them, because my aunt couldn't go to that place. She had to take care of my parents. She had to take care of her husband, who also hid. But in the meantime, he was taken away from their home. Things I did not know. I only learned later on. In any case, as I told you, I started working, and I worked in the barn. I fed the cows and so on and so on. And one morning, Mr. Hager called me in my Slovak nickname, which was Ferko. And I maybe it's a psychological aspect of my perception, I heard something very unusual in his voice. His calling Ferko, which was the sounded to me a little bit strange, not familiar, not like any other case before. He yelled to me, "Come to the barn, come fast, quickly." And I started running to him, and then I saw my parents.
Wow.
My reunion with my parents in front of the place at which we lived with the Hagers, of course, is not only in front of my eyes, but it makes me again very emotional. Yeah. Almost brings tears to my eyes, because it was almost a speechless reunion. We stood hugging each other for long minutes without one word saying.
Wow.
That was my reunion with my parents. I wanted to go back with them at home. They told me that there are some renovations to be done at the home. House is, glasses were broken and so on and so forth. 2 weeks later, I returned to my home and my new life began. All that summer, from May until September, my father prepared me for the next school year because I missed 1 year between September and June 44-45. So in 3 months, I had to learn what I missed in 1 year. My dad was a very intellectual person, knew how to do it. He prepared me, and I was enrolled in school. 1 month after enrolling my school, I joined one of the Zionist youth movements, with which I came into Aliyah in 1949. Between 45 and 49, I lived with my parents happily in our villa again, with that beautiful garden. And my social life was full of content and beautiful aspects in the youth movement at which I lived. I studied for 3.5 years in a gymnasium in Slovakia. 49, I made Aliyah to this kibbutz, and I live here ever since. And that's it. That's the story in my nutshell of my childhood until the age of 14. My parents did not come together with me because I came with a group within what was a youth Aliyah group. Youth Aliyah, one of the institutions of the Jewish Agency. But my parents came a few months after me. First my father, then my mother, and they were, despite limitations by the new communist regime in Czechoslovakia in 48-49, they were managed, my mother particularly, managed to get out with all the furniture of our department, and they settled in Haifa, first in a very small, tiny, one-room apartment, studio. Then they moved to another place and had a small apartment in Haifa, which, after we got married and our children were born, we used to visit every week to go to them, and they used to come to us. Haifa and Kfar Masaryk are not far to each other. My Yarden and I have been married for over 60 years now. We have 1 son and 1 daughter, and we have 6 grandchildren, Sheyubrim, as we say in Hebrew. Okay.
Avri, I want to ask you, your mother, she got back her valuables from the non-Jewish lady that she gave her the valuables to keep?
What the question about her?
She got back the valuables?
Yeah.
She gave them back?
Every valuable got back. And I met her daughter here in Israel. She visited us in our kibbutz because I wanted to her daughter, whom I remember as a child, she was of my age, I wanted to get from her some characterization of her mother.
Because that's
of a good
amazing
soul of person,
It's a very unusual.
Well, very, very. She was a woman of how would I say, of a genuine belief in God and in justice. As a Catholic, she was non-Jewish. But you know that people who believe and are a real believer and don't make business out of their beliefs can be beautiful persons. Absolutely. And she really was. So I didn't learn too much about her from the daughter, but I remember her as a child, and I remember that before I made Aliyah, I knew her. She lost her husband in the uprising of the Slovaks against the Nazis, and she had a very good relationship with her husband's sisters and mother, so he's part of the family. And before I made Aliyah, as a 14-year child, I went to their home to say goodbye from the old lady and her 2 daughters, and this lady was called Anna Shandorova. And I said goodbye to them, and they said that you are going to fulfill a beautiful dream. They were very much with me, despite the fact that we are no personal, we are not related to each other. But that's the kind of a person. To tell you 2 more things. One was that I managed with the Department of the Righteous Among Nations in Jerusalem to get the recognition of my aunt who supplied food to my parents and was the liaison person between them and myself, Maria Perlova, to be a Righteous Among the Nations, my aunt. And she
She's recognized.
She was recognized, and as she and her husband, my uncle, didn't have any children, I was the one who got the plaque of, which is here. I have it here.
This is incredible.
I'm proud to have it with me here.
And this is the plaque of the Righteous Amongst the Nations. Because she really saved your parents, and she saved
actually,
you.
If she did not give food to my parents every other day, she cooked for them at home and so on, they wouldn't have survived.
And there's a tree. There's a tree planted in.
Yeah. We had a big. My family. I mean, all our family participated in the celebration in Jerusalem. And if you want, I think I have a film of it, If you're interested, I may, send it over to you. So that there is another point. My inside told me not to ask for recognition of righteous of those who hit me, the Germans, although they would have deserved it, because of their son, who hit me. And I felt that I don't want to give him that happiness of saving a Jew, me, when he was one who actually hurt me and my soul until my very age now, which I remember as a humiliation, a terrible humiliation. However, on the other hand, I managed to bring to the recognition of Righteous Among Nations the Julai family who saved my parents at their plot, the neighboring place, that noble couple. And I'm talking not about the couple who passed away some 40 years ago or so, but their children and grandchildren. Even their children, they don't live anymore. And I contacted their grandchildren who live in Italy. And 2 years ago, in March 2019, just in March 2019, there was a celebration of recognition of the Julai family as Righteous Among the Nations in Rome, under the auspices of the Israeli embassy, at which 18 members of the Julai family and 5 members of my family got together in that. And I felt I'm very proud of the fact that I managed to get that for their grandfather and grandmother, and a very unusual contact began between my daughter and her age counterpart, and even my granddaughter and some of the great-grandchildren of my parents, rescuers. So it's something that I brought into the present time, skipping many decades, and I'm very happy that I not only managed to do so, but I was very determined to succeed in doing it, and I am happy it succeeded.
You closed the circle.
What is it?
You really closed the circle.
It's a closing circle, yeah. And I still correspond. During the time of the Corona, we correspond with each other, with people I never knew through my whole lifetime. How are you? There is a certain part who live in Venice, another part they live in northern Italy. They ask us how we are. I ask them, report about the family and so on and so forth. So actually there's a contact which I never dreamt about having with people I never knew, of a different, I might say, different social aspect. You know, we are simple people living in a kibbutz, and they are noble people with a lot of properties and so on, but that it makes no obstacle between two and more human beings, and that's what I am very happy about.
Wonderful.
Because that's a real human value, when you can communicate with people who may be, I don't know, super rich, but they are human beings. And I am a human being, and we can speak to each other on the same level as human beings, with not forgetting what happened and living the present and looking into the future.
It's magnificent. Speaking about the properties, did your family, did they get back their properties, the villa or the home?
The villa was never, the villa was confiscated by the authorities, and it was given back after the war. Unfortunately, due to certain developments in the communist era, it was lost, because they made my aunt, who was already a widow, accept a proposal to move out of that villa to a place in the middle of the town. They convinced her with all kinds of tricks and so on, and she signed that the property is no longer hers. We already lost our right, probably because my parents and my mother's sister lived out in other place, out of Czechoslovakia, agreed to transfer their rights in the villa to their brother and sister-in-law. When their brother died, the sister-in-law, the non-Jewish woman, left alone in the place, lived alone, together with her sister, who also was a widow already. And the authorities came to them and told them, we will give you a beautiful apartment in the middle of the town, and you just leave it and so on. So they left. They made all the signatures, legal procedures. The little place they got in the middle of the town was ugly and terrible. I visited it only once. And the villa and the garden no longer belonged to our family. In all my returns to Czechoslovakia, and it was many, many times, with my family, with friends, with my children and grandchildren and so on, 10, 15 visits, there was no one visit at which I missed the visit into the villa, to show them where I lived and tell them even the place at which my mother told me about the gas chambers, you know, some association in my thoughts and so on, and many other places inside the villa and the garden. And today I am very, how would I say, I'm very sorry that the villa no longer belongs, the property is no longer of our family. I personally do not need it. But if it would be our family's property, at least my grandchildren could have enjoyed either its value or even have their own vacations in summer, you know, when they are able to travel and have a good time in a place like that. But it's a lost thing, and we decided we are not going to cry about what is not ours. It just so happened. So we did get it back after the war, but we lost it in the decades after.
And Avri, I want to ask you, you mentioned your aunt, your very iconic and very, very, very important and very special aunt, Gissi Fleischmann.
Yeah.
What do you remember of Gissi Fleischmann?
I can tell you about Gissi Fleischmann memories of a child of age, 8, 7, 8, 9, which never lead me to what she has done. It only tells me that she was a very important person in a position which I at that time could not perceive what that position was. I remember having visited her in the office at which she did her important work, When I saw her there, she usually stood up of her desk. She embraced me, and I saw her many times sitting behind that desk with 3-4 books on one hand, handwriting, or how do you say, a printing machine?
A typewriter?
Yeah, at that time. And many times when I came in, there are some men sitting around her, and then in those moments I knew that they have nothing to do there. I don't want to disturb. And even when I visited her, I understood. She was a very warm person, an embracing person, and very nice to me. At that time she was already a widow who lived together with my grandmother, her mother, my father's mother. And that was the second place at which I remember her. But when I came to her office, I many times felt, at least in my childhood perception, that her thoughts may be somewhere else. She is getting me warmly, but she is concentrated in some other things. At that time I couldn't understand that her mind was into the Jewish community of Slovakia, to say it, at large.
She was in the working committee, the working group.
Yeah, of course. But I knew nothing about the working group. I knew none of them. I knew one person after the war, because he was a good friend of my father, not only of Gizi. He survived, Gizi did not. And he and my father, and my father's late brother, who was the first victim of Nazi Slovakia in September 1939, he was killed in the street of Bratislava. My uncle. And I remember visiting him in a hospital when he was wounded. My parents told me, "Do you want to see uncle? He's very ill." They didn't tell me that he was actually murdered. And one day, maybe a few hours after my visit in the hospital, he passed away. And I have beautiful memories of that uncle, Gizi, and my father's late brother. So there were three children, 2 of whom were murdered during the war. My uncle Gustav and my aunt Gizi. And my father survived. Gizi, I remember from visiting her and my grandmother at their little apartment in Bratislava until the summer of 1944. They were both widows. And at times I came to visit them either by myself or together with my parents. And it was a celebration of hospitality, with a good warm food, with a good atmosphere, with huggings and so on. So I remember Gizi at that home as a real member of my family. And the third place of which I remember Gizi was when she visited us in our garden. She used to come on weekends when she was free. She did not come together with her mother because my grandmother was not in good health at that time, to say the least. She died of cancer in 1945, half a year after liberation. Gizi came by herself, and during summertime and so on, we usually sat in the garden. I did not very often sit together with them because they were in talks which did not interest me. I was a child. I was running around in the garden, either by myself or with my friends and so on. But I remember Gizi coming to us when weather did not allow sitting outside. She was inside in the living room, a beautiful living room we had in the villa. But I remember Gizi from these 3 places: at her office, at her home, and at our garden and home. And that's it. I knew nothing about her until the end of the war, and only 2, 3, weeks, maybe a month, maybe or so, when people were still waiting for people who returned from concentration camps, there was still some hope until my parents got the sad news from witnesses who told them that Gizzi was gassed in Auschwitz. And that's it. From that very moment, we knew that she will not be with us.
And did you know that she was such a great hero, that she had worked tirelessly to try to save the Jews of Slovakia, what she did?
All I know about her, and I read a lot, in all books that I had available, and I still read, in English, in Slovak, in German, and in Hebrew. I collect all these things, and today I think that I can lecture about what she and the working group did. But it is not part of my personal history.
Yeah.
It is only what I acquired as an adult person who is interested in not only in person of Gizzi, but in history of the Holocaust and of the Jews in general in Slovakia or in Czechoslovakia.
And I think she sent her 2 daughters. They came to Israel, and they said, you should go with your daughters. And she said, no, I have to stay behind and help the Jews of Slovakia. And she had to be with her mother as well. She didn't want to leave her mother.
Yeah, it is a very complicated story. I think until the end of their lives, they did not forgive their mother that she preferred to give her life for the Jews of Slovakia instead of supporting them in them being quite abandoned alone in this country, in Eretz Israel, before Israel was established. I'm talking about, because they made Aliyah at the beginning of the war, 39, 40, I don't know exactly when. And they lived here, each in her milieu, I might say. There were letters of Gizzi and Gizzi's mother, their grandmother, and my grandmother, who these girls did not answer because of their anger. My grandmother sent postcards, which I have some photocopies of those postcards, in which she asked, tell us about you, how is your health? We are very concerned, we did not hear from you. And for many months, they did not even reply. And my only analysis of the lack of reply can be that they were angry, that they were just left alone here. When I came to Israel, I made contact with my sisters-in-law. And I was at that time 14, at the age of 15, and later understood that something happened to them in the ability to maintain a personal relationship within the family because of their feelings. I know that one of her daughters, the older one, Litzi was her name, used to visit my parents in Haifa because they lived in Mount Carmel, fresh air, and she came from Tel Aviv. So she spent some days in Haifa with a good family atmosphere, her uncle and aunt, and at times we also saw her there, and the other one, Yutzi, too, at my parents, or even here in the kibbutz, or my visits at their place. But I felt that something is lacking. It is not as a warm personal relationship as if it was, if the development would have been normal. It was not normal. And on their graveyards in Yarkon, the Tel Aviv area, there is an engravement in memory of Gizzi Fleischmann. So it's something that the younger did on the graveyard of the older one when she passed away, in memory of their mother. I don't recall whether it was in memory of their father too, who died because of some illness in 1942. Who knows what would have happened to him if he survived that illness. But in any case, it's the sad part of our family fate.
Do you have any connection with their descendants?
What?
Do you have any connection with their descendants, with their children?
They have no children.
Are they?
They were childless.
Both daughters?
I think their personal life was very complex, very complicated. I think Yuzi, the younger one, was married twice, divorced. When she died, she had a partner, she had a boyfriend, whom I didn't know, who was the person who inherited her. The older one was married to probably as far as I learned at that time, I didn't ask too much, a non-Jewish soldier of the British Army here, who was wounded or ill, and he was sent to a hospital in Switzerland, and she was with him until he passed away, and then she returned to Israel or to Palestine before Israel was established, just by herself. And I know that she had a long affair with a married man whom she never married, and no children whatsoever. None of them.
It's sad in a way.
So I want you to know that out of the three people of my parents' generation, in my father's family, my mother's family, I am the only child today. And my children are the only ones who continue the Fischer and Perl, maybe even Fleischmann, maybe, family history.
And Avri, I have to ask you, I mean, you went through the Shoah, you're a survivor. In all this time, did you keep emunah? Did you keep having a faith in Hashem? Was that important?
Keep what?
Emunah, having faith in...
You are talking about emunah in religious terms?
Or in Hashem, in a God?
It was until the end of the war. It completely departed from me after the war. I was not one of those who said, God saved my life. Mm-hmm. Because I was asking, if God saved my life, where was God when my aunt was perished? And I know that many people have asked such questions. Mm-hmm. People who were strong in their emunah continue to be strong in their emunah and believe that things are determined not exactly by a revenue, by God and so on. I personally lost my faith in God at the end of the war.
But you came to Israel and
I came as an Israeli, as a Jew, and not as a religious person. I came to build Israel as what was at that time called Chalutz, as a pioneer to build Israel. And that's why I came to a kibbutz, and I preferred to come together with my group to a kibbutz which was established by people who originally came from Czechoslovakia and bear the name of Masaryk, which had some significance to me after the war when I learned about Czechoslovakia as it was before the fascism overruled Slovakia and other places in Czechoslovakia.
And did you always feel you wanted to come to Israel? Were you from a very Zionistic? I know Gissi Fleischmann was very Zionish. She was very Zionistic. Your family was a very Zionistic family. Were your parents very Zionistic?
My father was a very Zionist family. Gissi Fleischmann was Zionist.
Yeah.
Their late brother was Zionist. My mother was less of a Zionist. She came from a Jewish family, I cannot say assimilating family, but not very strong in their attachment to Jewish Masoret, to tradition. But they were Jews. She used to go to the synagogue in high holidays. She has prayer books in 2 languages. She never knew the Hebrew prayers, but she had half of it in German, half of it in Hebrew, which I still keep somewhere in my records. And but she got adjusted or somehow adopted my Zionism and my father's Zionism when she decided to come together with us, I mean after me, to Israel. And that's where my parents lived until the end of their lives.
Wow. So I just want to mention, Avri, what was amazing about your aunt and I think your family and you as well, is that what made GC very, very special is that, and the whole working group, that it was so diverse. You had Haredi, very religious, irreligious, all working with a common purpose to save fellow Jews.
Yeah.
They mixed together. They were very religious, irreligious, Zionistic,
Right.
anti-Zionistic.
Right.
That wasn't important. What was important was the purpose of saving fellow human beings and fellow Jews.
What you're saying, of course, is in a nutshell what many people write, read, and speak about. To me, the fact that somehow Gizzi Fleischmann's personality was the binding person of all those people of different backgrounds for one common purpose is a real source of pride of mine, because that's her contribution to save even one soul of Jews. I don't know how many were saved, maybe many, not maybe, probably by various acts they taken. But at the end, unfortunately, among the whole 5, 6, or 7 members of the group, she was the only one who was killed in Auschwitz. Of course, there is a sad history of the Weissmantel family and of Rabbi Frieder, who died 1 year after the war, after the end of the Holocaust, and he lost his wife and so on. In any case, that's each one of his and her fate. But as years went by, I learned more and more about Gizzi Fleischmann, because in my childhood, I only knew that she was an important person. But I want to give you one example. When my father passed away in 1977, at the age of 83, there was a eulogy, you say, in the newspaper, one of the newspapers. And in that eulogy, someone who was active in Zionist circles during the war and after the war wrote about Dr. Fischer, my father, and he said that he and his sister Gizzi Fleischmann and whatever, etc., etc. A friend of mine who knew my father here in Israel, a member of Kibbutz Kfar Masaryk, who came originally from Czechoslovakia, who survived the war as a partisan in Czechoslovakia and in the Slovak underground, came to me. He said to me, Avri, I never knew that Gizzi Fleischmann, that great personality, is your aunt. So, you know, things somehow appeared to me. It was more or less like many people who in Israel, and not only here, but in Bratislava too, came over to me in past 20 or 30 years, who said to me, you are Dr. Fischer's son? He used to be my pediatrician. Wow. What a wonderful person, you know. And it made me feel really good, you know, to hear authentic testimonies of people.
So I just want to quote from Mordechai Paldiel. He says about your aunt, he says, a brave woman, a brave leader, a person who chose to stand at the head of a group that tried to save a community. I don't know any other woman who did something similar during the Holocaust or indeed before it. And it's really a testimony of your family.
To say that a person like him doesn't know any other person like her is a superlative over and over anything else, you know. And he's not a person who was saved by her or says good thank you to you.
Okay, he was also quoting Yehuda Bauer, who wrote those words. But it's an amazing thing, because he to say, I mean, that is an incredible statement to say
from
about
Yehuda Bauer, I learned one thing. He was a good friend of mine, and I don't communicate with him now because he's in already advanced age. So am I, but he's about 10 years older than I am. Once we met in the United States in one of his tours, and at that time I was in a certain function in New York, and I asked him, I was invited to a Yom HaShoah, which at that time was not the international Yom HaShoah in January, you know. It was more or less at the time Israel celebrated, marked that day in May 1982, I think it was, to Chicago. They knew that I am a survivor or maybe a quasi-researcher or whatever. I said to him, what do you think, Yehuda? Should I speak about my personal experience or something general? He said, if you decide to speak about the personal, it will be a personal meeting in a small circle. When it's a big gathering, maybe it should be rather focusing on some aspects. You know what I suggest to you? I suggest to you to speak about ways of resisting the Nazi regime. Not one way, ways in plural. Not only ghetto fighters, not only partisans, but even a act like the working group and your aunt Gizi Fleischmann. Even that and the underground of the Jewish youth movements in Hungary, I don't know to what extent you are familiar, with falsifying papers, with making the glass house in Budapest a home of refuge for people, Jews, and so on. These are also ways of resistance, so that people can know that not only the Vilna ghetto fighters, and not only Mordechai Anilevich and others in ghetto Warsaw, but also people in other places which are much less known than Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. Who knows about Slovakia? Who knows about Hungary? You know, in Chicago. Speak about that. Very interesting. Very interesting.
And you took his advice?
And still.
You took his advice?
Yeah, I did take his advice. I prepared myself well as I could, and that's what it was. You know, apropos Yehuda Bauer. Let me make some.
Avri, I just want to ask you to end off, because this has been riveting and unbelievable. What message do you give to your children and grandchildren and to the future generations? What message, through looking what you've gone through, what you experienced, what you've learned through the years, what can you impart onto the next generation?
Okay, let me try to answer that, and then I will make some coffee and give some cake. To me and my wife Yardena, our contacts with the grandchildren, our children and grandchildren, which is a very open one, is not focused around on our experience in the Holocaust. It does not escape that moment, that element. And my wife Yardena's own experience in the Holocaust in Budapest is much graver and much more terrible than mine, because her mother was shot into the Danube, on the bank of the Danube, and she was on a death march from Budapest in the westbound towards Austria, and she was taken out by her non-Jewish stepfather. So it's a real story, a dramatic story. But we never did, neither with our children in our younger age, nor with our grandchildren as we grew older, turn into our faith in the Holocaust as something around which the family atmosphere has to prevail. But we decided that whenever they ask us, we will give them honest answers. authentic answers on what we experienced in the past and what we feel and think in later years, retrospectively, today, and so on. So that is a very important guiding line for us, and that brought us actually to our responses to their willingness to visit places at which we experienced our childhood. In all, I told you that all our visits went to my villa and garden. It was not only then. I took my grandchildren, and of course the whole family, but not all together, even to that little farm at which I was at the end of the war. And I told them, in this very place, there was the house at which I lived. Here I met my parents when they came to visit. There I worked, there was no barn whatsoever anymore. There, about 50, 60 or so meters from here, that's where I worked, and so on and so forth. So every single place which I could remember was part of my story to them. And I answered all their questions as well as I could, and they still ask me. And one of the continuous questions that came to me, when are you going to finish to write down your own memoirs of that time? And I said, soon, because I have to rush. In my old age, I already have to go ahead. But your question was much beyond that. You ask, how do I see them in the light or whatever of my own beliefs and so on. Whatever. I would like to have them, first of all, as human beings, being clean morally, human beings.
Honest,
and productive. I mean, not exploit someone else and not being exploited by anyone, standing on their own, both economically if possible and personally. Learn as much as they can, but without being forced to do it. And if anyone decides to be a street cleaner, okay, I will not be very happy, but if that's what he would wish to do, he would get our blessing to do so. None of them went to be a doctor today, but they are all involved in things. Many of them are in high tech. The youngest one is our granddaughter. She's now in the army, and we have no more grandchildren in the army service. All of the other ones are beyond and behind. And I want them to be conscientious citizens of this country, with openness toward, open-minded to all kinds of beliefs of people. So am I, because I can understand that I don't have to force myself with my own conviction and so on someone else, and I don't want someone else to force it upon me. This is what I look forward to in my children and grandchildren as well. And I only hope that, first of all, be happy, they will be happy, and the other things, of course, that they will fulfill their own dreams, many of which may be very similar to my dreams about the generations to come.
So I just want to thank you. Avri, I want to thank you so much. It's been such an honor and a privilege to be here and to listen to your incredible, unbelievable story, really. And you just, it's from the bottom of your heart, really. And I'm so grateful. And I really want to thank you.
I thank you for your thanks. I want you to know that I skipped some parts of it, which when I publish my own memoirs, they will be in it.
I look forward to reading it.
They will come, as they be published, they will come and you will be able to see the other things which I missed, either for not bringing into my memory at this moment, or just because I, at this moment, saw them less important than the other ones.
Well, whatever you said was so important and so illuminating and just so incredible, really. and we're witnessing history.
First of all, secondly, first of all, I already said. Secondly, I want to thank you again, but I want to tell you a little story about my experience in another place at which I spoke in America. I was asked on Yom HaShoah to speak in Brooklyn to an audience of about 100 or 120 people who gathered. And I told my own story. In this time, it was not an analysis of the Holocaust in Slovakia, but my own story as a child who survived the Holocaust. When I finished speaking, there was a person who stood up in the audience and he said, with all due respect, what you told us, it is not a Holocaust. I will tell you what a Holocaust is. And he told his story, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, about he as a child who saw his parents being murdered in front of his eyes, who looked for his way in the woods of Poland or Lithuania, wherever, who was hungry day by day, who never knew where he's going to sleep, who was persecuted day by day and so on. That's a Holocaust. And I said to him, I am really shocked by your story, which is a story of horror. I was asked to speak about my own story. And I suggest to all of you, think about the fact that as many as Jews as there are survivors of the Holocaust, there are different stories of the Holocaust. Each one of them is a story of the Holocaust.
Sure.
And let us not judge how one suffered more and the other one suffered less. And I suggest to all of you to ask our friend who just spoke to you to present his own history in the next Yom HaShoah. And I don't know whether they applauded me, there was a large consent to what I said. So
it was so right what you said. It's so true. It's so true.
Yeah, this is what I believe in. And I am telling you this because I know that being a hidden child, separate from my parents, is much less than a survivor of the Holocaust, like my friend Tommy Shacham, who survived Auschwitz and lost there his father and his brother. It is not as horrible as his story.
But each story is individual. Each story is significant.
Each one has his or her own individual story, and this is what we have to preserve and somehow convey to the generations to come, either in writing or in oral history.
I couldn't agree with you more. I really could not agree with you more.
Okay, thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you. Now let's have